featuring Shashi and Kanishk Tharoor in conversation with Dr. Shondeep Chatterjee. This is a Manyavar special session. Parallelly, at 5:15, I beg your pardon, the Western Quadrangle will host Shudhir Datto, the Ananda Purashkar winning poet, and Srijato, who will discuss the place of classical and modern language in Bengali poetry. The session is titled Kobitar Bhasha, and it is a special presentation from Standard Chartered Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now almost ready to welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor once again, Kanishk Tharoor, and with them Dr. Shondeep Chatterjee. All right, there's this very tiny photo op happening there as they take the stage. Welcome, welcome.
Good evening and welcome to this father and son session. I guess asking a brain surgeon to look at landmark literature is a bit like asking Virat Kohli to value the Victoria Memorial. And hence, the subject of this discussion today has been clothed in the guise of a genetic analysis. Is there a writing gene? We have two fabulous authors, two fabulous books. Shashi's recent book, An Era of Darkness. Kanishk's debut book, Swimmer Among the Stars. Two books in contrast. One book, Shashi's, which is a story of what I would call a national nightmare. Kanishk's book, a book of delightful dreams. Shashi's book, a forthright look at history. Kanishk's figurative narration of beautiful stories. Shashi's book, a dramatic dissection of history, whereas Kanishk's is probably a narrative history of subdued drama. And I think I have to start by asking the youngest member on the dais today, does he agree? Is there a writing gene? Have you been bestowed a bit of gene from your father that has affected your writing?
Well, before I answer that question, I just want to say that it's such a pleasure to be here. I live in New York City, but apart from New York, my only real home in the world is Calcutta. And so it's really great to be here with so many familiar faces and family and friends here. Thank you. Well, you know, I don't want to essay genetic analysis, because that's not particularly my forte. But I do really, owe a lot to my father and my mother, who many of you also know in the audience. She's from Calcutta. Because they were people who surrounded our childhood with books. We were raised in houses that were always overflowing with books and overflowing with the activity of reading and writing. And, for my brother and me, I have a twin brother who incidentally is also a writer, so I suppose it's the family business. For us, we had the great privilege of seeing writing and reading happening around us, and it seeming like a very logical and obvious thing to do. And that was our fortune, and as a result, I think we both journeyed into careers in which writing and reading were natural, integral parts of it.
Did your father's writing per se influence you, as opposed to your father as a person?
I think we have very different styles of writing, but I think, yes, it did, definitely. I think his interest in the past, his interest in his fiction, in exploring political and historical themes through the sort of imaginative style of fiction is something that I think I also do. Many of the stories in my collection are engaging with political and historical subjects. And I think in part because those are the things that really interest me, and I use fiction as a vehicle to get there.
Shashi, what do you think? Do you think your son has a writing style which has been influenced by you? I was influenced by you when you wrote your centenary prize-winning essay in St. Xavier's School, which won you a prize on Man of the Year, My Choice, and I remember it was Mujibur Rahman that you wrote about, but that was in the 70s. I'm sure you've forgotten about it.
I have. Thank you for reminding me.
But do you think that your son has been influenced more by you as a father or more by you as a writer?
Oh, well, I don't want to speculate on relatives. First of all, let me add to what Kanish said and say what a pleasure to see you all here on a holiday afternoon, sitting here to listen to this conversation. And, I am proud of occasionally finding myself listed amongst Calcutta writers, even at my only exposure to the city were my high school years. My parents lived here for a good dozen years, and I would come and visit all the time when I was away in college and then in graduate school. And of course, for my son, this is very much home, and whenever I come, I have family to visit here as well. So it's wonderful in many respects for us to be having this conversation in front of you. Even if those of you who were here last night know that I said that sitting in front of this otherwise beautiful building, which is also a monument to colonial loot, that I would have liked to see it converted into a museum of colonialism right inside that will depict the atrocities of the British Raj. But one day perhaps we will succeed in getting that done. I just had to put that little footnote into the discussion. But on your question, first of all, if there is a writing gene, it seems to improve in the next generation, because I think he's a far better writer.
That's called evolution, isn't it?
That's evolution, actually, yes. He is proof of the theory of evolution. I mean, evolution says, people shed their unnecessary things and just the fitter elements continue. And I think that's precisely what's happening, because I love Kanish's writing, and very often I'm in awe of it. I mean, there are things that I read and think, my God, I couldn't have written that. So I certainly would be presumptuous to suggest that that there's any direct line of descent, but a fondness for books and words. Certainly, his mother and I had a house full of books, as he said. We talked, we read a lot. My late father was very fond of words. Just everything. He wrote beautiful letters, but he also played Scrabble obsessively, played word games in the car, and unfortunately passed away when my kids were still rather young. They were barely 9 years old. But I think some of that subliminally may have contributed to the sense in their childhood that words matter. And when they were babies, I would read to them. Before they could understand any words, they were being read to from books. And this whole thing of books, reading, stories, writing, all of this was there from their very, very young years. And I'm not sure that Minu or I particularly thought we were going to make writers out of them or anything like that. It was just for us an important way of being that we wanted them to imbibe. And I think they've taken it to a greater level of perfection, or perfection is the wrong word perhaps, but of ability and competence and so on, than we could have dared hope. The other thing that I will say is that as far as, I still remember them, for example, literally running around my first book release event in New York when we were about 7 years old, as little children. And of course they came to other book release events. They saw this as something that people did. There were books, they were released, people read them, people talked about it. Questions were asked. This is something that was part of their upbringing growing up. And I suppose with hindsight, to think of this as a natural thing to do would have occurred to them without any conscious thinking. I remember inaugurating the All India Ophthalmological Association, and the outgoing or incoming president, I forget which, told me with great pride that that day his son had graduated as an ophthalmologist and was going to join his father's practice. I mean, it's a natural thing, I suppose, at one level, on the part of the son to do what he sees his father doing, and the part of the father to celebrate his son doing it.
We'll make no comment about the medicine aspect of that, but ask Kanishk, you were writing about fiction when your dad has predominantly delved with facts. Is your writing fiction a reaction to the fact that he's been more obsessed with facts?
Well, I'll
Why
answer
may
that
you choose
question.
fiction over facts?
Well, one thing I just wanted to add before then is that, I'm lucky not just to have my parents as influences for me in the activity of writing, but also I have my grandmother who's sitting here in the front row of this audience, who's a writer herself, and who, in my few decades of life, has imbued them with the love for storytelling. And even now, when I come back to visit in Calcutta, it's my great fortune that I get to hear my grandmother's stories again. So I just wanted to note that. I'm also a journalist, so my love for fiction isn't exclusive. I'm interested in also writing and thinking about the world in a more traditionally non-fiction way. And I don't rule out the possibility in the future that I would write a non-fiction book. But I do definitely feel that my first calling is to fiction, and that the way I want to explore, engage with the world, because fiction is still, for all its imaginative qualities, you're still using it to engage with the real world outside of you. But I still feel that fiction right now, for me, is the best way to do that. And this first book, and I'm working on a novel right now, are my attempts to sort of begin that project.
Do you think?
Something that I can also chip in. The fact is that the fact that he's at ease with both, I'd like to say that it's the same with me. 4 of my first 5 books were fiction. I wrote 3 novels and a collection of short stories. If the circumstances of my life made it difficult for me to sustain fictional writing, and I ended up writing my last dozen books or something, are all pretty much non-fiction. But the fact is that when you read his columns in the Hindustan Times, or you read his stories, he's obviously equally comfortable in those mediums. And I still think that if tomorrow he wrote something, a longer book-length sequence in non-fiction, it wouldn't surprise me.
And do you think there is a similarity of writing styles, if not content?
No, I mean, that's for others to judge. I don't think so.
I use fewer puns.
Well,
Puns and alliterations are not his thing.
what do you think? I mean, a lot of people think that both of you have a certain lyricism in your writings. You certainly do in your first book. Do you agree with that? You think that both you and your father in your writings
I
have a
think
certain lyrical
my-
quality to the writing, which is probably well defined in some of your descriptions in your short stories, as indeed in his last book?
Both my parents instilled in my brother and me a kind of love for playing with language. And my father, I did say that I use fewer puns, which is true, but I think I appreciate them nevertheless. And my parents, and my father especially, with his love for Woodhouse, with his love of playing with language, it really, I think that love for it is something that we have. And I do think in writing fiction that what distinguishes fiction now, especially from forms like TV and cinema, which are immeasurably easier and more accessible ways of receiving narrative and looking at the world, that what distinguishes fiction is really language. And that if the language isn't, in my opinion, inventive, lyrical, and artful, then the narrative may as well not be in fiction,
If I can again chip in there, one thing I will tell you that Kanishk probably got more from his mother and from me was his very, very good eye for visual descriptive writing, which I don't really have. I think in words. I don't think in images. His mother, though she's not published fiction, even in letters or messages, she will use very beautifully descriptive language. And I think that sort of sense of the visual has come to him in a way that unfortunately has bypassed me.
And having lived opposite his mother's house for years, I think I know her her ability to think of the visual element. But I'm just going to read a paragraph from each of their books to show you the similarity in style, which they don't seem to agree very much about. But I'm going to read it to you. This is a little extract from Kanishk's story about the elephant at sea. And this is a description of an elephant, and I'm going to just read out from his book a little sentence or two. Several studies have shown that they can recognize their own reflections, suggesting, however rudimentary there may exist amongst elephants, an amorphous theory of the mind. And then he goes on to write, in sum, these scraps formed an altogether surreal idea of the elephant, one incommensurate with the full being in front of him, dappled with cooling splashes of mud, blinking restlessly and curling its trunk around the legs of its driver. There's a lot of visual imagery in that, and you don't get that from Shashi very easily, that sort of visual imagery. Would you agree, Shashi?
Totally. That's exactly my point.
Whereas with Shashi, it's the word imagery, and I love, I mean, I know this is perhaps not the fundamental theme of his book, but I love what he talks about when he talks about cricket and sport. And I read, he says, sport played an important role in British imperialism, since it combined Victorian ideas of muscular Christianity, a cult of youthful vigor, and daring-do in far-off lands, and the implicit mission of bringing order and civilization in the unruly East through the imposition of rules learnt on the playing fields of Eton. A lot of descriptive imagery there. Would you agree? I know you're passionate about cricket, and cricket seems to find a lot of space in this era.
Description, but it's not visual description. You see what I mean?
Yes.
In fact, the two paragraphs you've chosen actually...
A lot of word play.
illustrate my point.
Yeah.
I'm a man of words, and Kanishk's words, ideas, and images are much more organically intertwined.
Exactly. So this is exactly what I was going to tell you. That do you think this is something that is ingrained in the way you've always written, the way you've always looked at life, or is this something that you've developed as you've matured as a writer?
I mean, it's difficult to explain the why, but it's certainly true. The what is very clear. That from the youngest years of my writing, and I did start writing very, very young. I was better at all sorts of things. The use of the right word, I hope, in the right place. The effective communication of an idea, but one thing I didn't try often enough was visual description. Whether it was a scene of a countryside, whether it was a moment like just a description of a physical being, in this case the elephant, could be another creature or a human being. That was where I would say I probably instinctively sort of shied away from trying to do that, because it didn't come naturally to me. And on a few occasions I've done, it's usually brief, perfunctory, and maybe even slightly forced. With him, it seems much more natural. I think that when I read his style and mind, of course you're reading non-fiction and comparing it to fiction, so that's not fair, but if you were to read any sort of paragraph of any of my novels, I don't think you'd really see this as being similar to Kanishk. I think he has his own way of approaching things. And he does it, to my mind, with tremendous flair and readability in a way that's quite different from mine. To some degree, my impact is through my words, his impact is through his language and imagery, and I hope in both cases, at the end, the ideas are what matter.
But I think there's also an overarching similarity in the sort of, I think, overarching the force that sort of imbues a lot of our fiction and non-fiction. You know, in my father's first novel, The Great Indian Novel, he plays with a historical text, and he finds in it a kind of urgency for the present. And I think in my fiction too, even though I'm not directly writing about Indian epics or even India necessarily, I think I do also have that interest in seeing the world in large part through the prism of the past, and feeling that there is a kind of urgency to be found in looking back in time.
When you talk about the prism of the past and we're talking about Elephant at Sea, I just can't help but ask you the question, was it inspired by your father's experience in the Foreign Service?
Well, I mean, it's...
Or did it have some relation?
My Shondip Misho is talking about one of the stories in my collection called Elephant at Sea, which tells the story.
Tell them the story a little bit as well.
It tells the story of an elephant that was dispatched by the Indian Foreign Service from India to Morocco after the Moroccan princess at some point asks the Indian ambassador there for an elephant. 6 years later, when the elephant finally arrives, she has grown up and completely lost interest in this elephant in the first place. Now, what was amusing about this story is that it's based completely on a real life event, which I happened to hear from a young age from a friend of my family, of my father's, who worked in the IFS. And so this story sort of remained with me for a long time. About a decade ago, I visited Morocco, and I was thinking about it when I was there, and the story emerged out of my trip in Morocco. But what was amazing when this book was first launched in January in India, last January, was that when I had a book event in Delhi, a remarkable woman came to the event, and she turned out to be the daughter of the Indian ambassador at the time that this actually happened. And she was incredibly moved by this story because apparently my descriptions of her father, of what transpired in Morocco with this elephant, were accurate. Now, I found that very strange because I hadn't been trying to be really truthful to any kind of record of the story. I was, I have the skeleton of something that actually happened, but I was putting all kinds of imaginative flesh on it.
So this is like facts in the guise of fiction?
It is quite...
See, the thing is, the story that was told to us by the grand old man of Indian diplomacy, Shashi Tharoor, that story actually ended about a third of the way to Kanishk story. The rest is Kanishk's imagination. But he used to relish telling the story of this princess asking for the elephant, and the elephant arriving years later when no one was expecting it, and the hilarious journey of the elephant from the ports all the way to the capital. And that was more or less where the story ended. Kanishk has given it many more dimensions than anything ever heard. But on this particular element of the ambassador's daughter, Shashi never described the ambassador. I mean, we didn't know the name or the appearance of this. Kanishk gave him an image, gave him a moustache and all that. And this ambassador's daughter says he did have a moustache. And described the man grooming his moustache exactly the way she remembered her father, which is totally fact imitating fiction.
Amazing. How did you manage that?
It's quite an experience to, out of almost in an almost whimsical way, put something out into the world and then have it returned to you in reality.
Was that true of your story about the United Nations Assembly in space as well?
Well, I mean, there is some experience shadowing that.
I could see that.
I wrote a story. It was actually I was inspired by something I read in the newspaper, of all places, about the Parliament of Libya meeting in a luxury Greek ferry off the coast of the country because it was too unsafe to actually meet in Libya itself. And I found that something quite amazing about this image of a parliament trying to run a country from outside the country. And I took that to its logical extreme, and I imagined a future in which the world is ravaged by climate change and disruption, and the United Nations is meeting in a near-Earth orbital hotel in outer space. And so that was based in part on my own experience at the United Nations, which inevitably, having grown up in New York City and having gone to the United Nations school, having my father who worked at the UN, I have spent a decent amount of time in that world. But also, I had a bit of fun with that.
Father's shadow on that story as well, Shashi?
No, the thought had never occurred to me, but it was absolutely fun. Mind you, when he sent me the draft, the manuscript, I was far too literalist in my reading, saying, Lithuania wouldn't do this or Japan wouldn't do that, because he named the characters after their country. So there was Japan dancing with Australia or whatever. I mean, I could not help thinking except in UN terms. So it could only have been written by a non-UN official.
But one who knew an UN official very well.
That's right.
I love the zero G part of that story, the zero G experience. Is that something that you just thought out Or was it something that you dreamt about or imagined? Or would you like to have seen your father in a
And I
zero
think
G state in the United Nations Assembly?
one thing that is, not entirely inherited from my parents or anybody else is I think both my brother and I have a fondness for science fiction. And I think there's a science fiction element in that story that I think is authentically my own, as opposed to dropped from a tree.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a very difficult question. Of all the short stories in your book, which is your favorite and why?
I mean, it's difficult to call it a short story, but it's one of the reasons I like it so much is it's probably one of the more recent things I've written that's in the collection, and it's a series. It's a reimagining of the Iskandarnama, which is a medieval Persian retelling of the legends around Alexander the Great. And it's a text that I found very interesting for a long time, and I sort of take it apart and, in a series of vignettes, play with the themes of this what's called the Alexander Romance, which is a series of mythic myths and tales that spread from the Middle East all the way to Scotland in one direction and to Southeast Asia in another direction, and was a kind of global literature before global literature. And I've always been very interested in all these tropes, in the tales of Alexander, the battles between Alexander's artists and the artists of China, in Alexander erecting a magical mirror that can spy pirates, anyway, and so forth. So I took these tales and gave them a slightly more modern and novelistic shape in the form of a series of vignettes.
I'm going to now tell you about a little difference in your style of writing, which is very apparent. You've already heard that in the conversation so far. But that is I think, Kanishk's descriptions, if I may use the word, little overstated imagery, contrasting with Shashi's understated imagery. And I'm going to just give you two examples, and I'll ask you to comment on that. Here's oh yes, always did that from St. Xavier's school days. The story from Icebreaker. I love this description of the Aurora Australis. And I read from Kanishk's book where he writes, "The Aurora Australis returns that night, a dancing green. The researchers explain to the less learned that it is the wondrous spell of solar winds funneling motes of sunfire into the Earth's magnetic field. The journalists quieten beneath its display. The aurora always inspires reverence and humility. Inuit people in Greenland claim that their ancestors float in the aura, playing football with the skull of a walrus." I love that. I also love the fact that it's the first time I've heard journalists being quietened. Compared to that, if you read Shashi's rather understated but very, very, very poignant description of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, I love that paragraph. And this is what he writes. "History knows the event as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The label connotes the heat and fire of slaughter, the butchery by bloodthirsty fighters of an outgunned opposition. But there was nothing of this at Jallianwala Bagh. Dyer's soldiers were lined up calmly, almost routinely. There were neither feelings."
Yeah, I think Jallianwala Bagh was the episode that most incarnated the atrocity that the British Raj represented. Because, Dyer had been sent to quote-unquote pacify the Punjab, and he had promulgated what we today call Section 144, it may still have been 144 then, where basically people could not gather in groups of more than 5. But happened to be Vaisakhi Day. And all these villagers had come from neighboring villages to gather to celebrate Vaisakhi in this compound, which happened to be walled with only one gate, one entrance, and therefore only one exit. So they almost certainly did not know that they were not allowed to gather in this number. Dyer, hearing reports that there were a couple of thousand people gathered in this spot, proceeded there with a detachment of soldiers, didn't issue any warnings, didn't even ask what they were doing, nothing, just opened fire. It was the most extraordinarily psychopathic behavior on the part of this man. And of course, a lot of women and children were killed because they were all there to celebrate a festival. They were not there for any political purposes. Obviously, they were not armed. And in later testimony, for example, the Hunter Commission and so on, he cheerfully admitted that he positioned his troops near the gate because that made the target practice even easier because they were all trying to flee towards the gate, so he shot them as they were trying to flee. So apart from the utter brutality and killing, practically no bullet missed its mark. Even in the British admission of how many people were killed, the numbers meant that almost every bullet took a victim. That kind of turkey shoot, as it were. At the end of all of this, Dyer was so brutal that he would not let the dead and the dying be tended to. So that for 24 hours the bodies rotted in the sun, people were dying, mourning for water, they were not allowed to be served water. Nothing, nobody was allowed to step in. Indians were made to crawl on the street on their bellies, a street where allegedly a missionary woman had been assaulted. And while they were crawling, if they so much as raised their heads, they would be hit on the head with a laugh. Dyer then made various other orders, made every youth of a particular age come and stand in the square and be stripped and searched, all sorts of humiliation. On top of that, what they did was to ensure that the official commission pretty much whitewashed him. The Congress Party conducted a commission. Jawaharlal Nehru was an active participant in that, revealed some of the brutality. And Dyer eventually had to be punished, he had to be demoted and moved aside. But the British public collected so much money for him, it amounted to £250,000 sterling in today's money, and was collected and presented to him as a prize for having massacred Indians and treated them this way, together with a bejeweled sword. And Rudyard Kipling, that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, hailed him as the man who saved India. So everything about it, the brutality, the cruelty, the unnecessary racism, the self-justification, the self-congratulation over such an atrocity, all of that collectively encapsulates to me the worst thing about the British Raj. And that's why I feel so strongly about Jallianwala Bagh. Of course, in many ways it created the Indian nationalist movement. It made Tagore give up his knighthood. It converted Mahatma Gandhi away from the path of cooperation that he had embarked upon during the First World War. It persuaded many of the constitutionalists that they were not going to get justice from the British. As in Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, it made a lot of people who had previously thought of themselves as Kashmiris or Punjabis or whatever into Indians, because they realized that there was a common cause, that a nation was being suppressed by the British. So in many ways it was a seminal moment in our struggle. It's the only episode that I've described in so much detail for a couple of pages because of its importance to me in the historical context.
Did you intentionally understate the dramatization? You avoided dramatizing the event completely, didn't you?
One could have gone even further over the top. So at one point I just paused and simply quote Bill Durant's narrative, saying, an Indian will get too emotional here. So let a foreigner describe what happened next.
I'm just going to ask you one question while we're on this novel theme. The novel seems to be almost an expansion of your famous speech in that debate.
You mean the book, The Era of Darkness?
Yeah, The Era of Darkness. I was going to ask you, why did you want to convert that, what was obviously written as a speech before and a book was written later, I presume that's correct. What made you want to change that speech, which had a fantastic impact, being a speech of about, 20 minutes or so?
No, I think it ended up being close to 15.
Okay.
It was meant to be 8 or 10, but they didn't ring the bells. So we kept on talking. But
So-
no, let me say first of all, I didn't want to convert it. And it was not a written speech, it was just an off-the-cuff
Yeah,
speech.
that was obvious, yeah.
But what happened was that when the speech went so viral on YouTube, and millions of people were viewing it, and so on, my publisher, David Davida, who's also Kanishk publisher, called me and said, look, you've got to make a book out of this. I said, why bother? Doesn't everyone know this already? And he said, no, everyone doesn't know this, so your speech wouldn't have gone viral. That's what persuaded me, that there was some value, that the very way in which this had been received, and so many people were speaking and behaving as if their eyes had been opened to something they should have known as Indians, then maybe I did need to write something they could go back and refer to, which would obviously be more substantive than a 15-minute speech could be.
Did it require a lot of historical research?
It did. It did, and I'm very privileged and fortunate that the internet era is upon us, because the amount of research and reading I had to do for this book, in the earlier days, see, at the time that I did my doctorate, which is now 4 decades ago, I would have had to go to so many, a dozen libraries, spend hours in musty bookshelves and take me further hours writing down and scrawling little handwritten notes. Whereas here I was able to get a couple of researchers, tell them what I was looking for, and piles of original documents, entire volumes from the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries, new scholarly articles by contemporary scholars. Everything was available to me on a Google Drive to be perused in comfort in my own study. So to that degree, modern facilities made my life much easier. Of course, it helped that I was writing on a subject on which I already had a fairly coherent view. But obviously, I always explain to people, I don't really think there is any truly objective history, that everyone has a point of view. But as long as it's based on documented facts, then you're entitled to choose the facts you wish to focus upon. Others may choose other facts and construct a different meaning to those facts. But for me, I found more than enough evidence to substantiate the arguments I had made in the Oxford speech. And indeed, I have gone into greater depth on many of those issues, obviously, than I could have in a speech.
If I can just be a bit provocative, what took you so long to make this point? Why did you wait so many years since you've been writing for so long?
Yeah, I look back on it and I ask myself the same question, because these were things that had obsessed me for a very long time. I was always a bit of a history nut. Recently, a family member stumbled across a notebook written in my St. Xavier school days when I was 14 years old, which consisted of history essays the school had not required me to write. So the teacher had not assigned this as homework. It's just that I was never satisfied with what the textbooks told me. So I'd gone to the library and looked at other books and written essays for myself on aspects of modern Indian history. So, captivated was I by the subject. So I'd always been obsessed. I did my history honors at St. Stephen's College. And then I suppose I would, at that point, not have presumed to think I was qualified to write a book, though I enjoyed reading it. And I also probably felt that what I believed was in many ways what any serious reader of Indian history was bound to conclude on the basis of the available evidence. So maybe it took those 40 years of people not giving it that kind of repeated emphasis in their studies and allowing themselves to forget what had happened. Maybe it was all of that that was necessary before a book like this would find its place and its time.
Talking about internet research, Kanishk, did you have to do a lot of internet research for your book? Whether what causes the aurora australis, or whether a ship's captain at sea can get asthma in the rarefied atmosphere of the North Pole? Sorry, I just chose the medical aspect.
No, yes, there is some internet research in the book, and it is obviously a useful resource. But I think that points more to the fact that when I'm writing fiction, I'm not just thinking about, say, the functioning of relationships or necessarily the way the plot would work. I am interested in bringing in facts and stories and legends from other places, and often, the quickest thing to do is to do a Google search. But no, in general though, when you're writing fiction, which is very different from working on a work of non-fiction, you're trying to be immersed as much as possible in the work itself. And you don't want to get too sidetracked by the process of research, which can be very distracting, because I often find, I'm working on a novel right now for which I have to do some research. And
What's it called?
let me not get into the details of it right now, but I find often that it's more pleasurable to do the research than the arduous, often agonizing act of the writing. So it can be very easy to get bogged down in doing research. With a book like my father's recent book, which is non-fiction, discursive, it's making a claim about the world, he has to spend a lot of time doing that research. With fiction, it's a more delicate balance, and often, you can teeter into the wrong direction.
Do you think that one of the things about your writing styles, which I find also very obvious, is one of Shashi's criticisms, if I may say so, is that sometimes in your novels, particularly earlier ones, you have very long-winded sentences, very long. Shall I give you an example?
No, it's okay, I confess.
Uh,
Give
uh,
me a shot.
Whereas I think, Kanishk, do you think you've made a deliberate attempt, short sentences constructed as if it's much easier to follow them compared to your dad's?
I'm looking at my wife in the front row, who's a big fan of long sentences and always encourages their writing.
And your grandmother as well.
Yes, of course. And no, I think I try for a variety. I think the best thing to do is you don't want to. Wouldn't just want to write in the kind of staccato of short sentences, but I aim for a variety. One of the I don't know, either fortunes or misfortunes of being raised a bit in the American literary world is that there's this, in the US at least, less so in other parts of the English-speaking world, there's a great emphasis on economy. And that's actually something I, as a writer, have had to, so that means in the understated, in austere language, in pared down language. And it means that I, as a writer, when my instincts go in the other direction, towards imagery, towards lyrical language, I've had to wrestle with that a little bit as I've developed myself as a writer. And maybe, my slightly often shorter sentences are a testament to that. But no, I don't think I would ever abandon the long sentence. I think there's a lot to be gained from it.
Yeah, there are some sentences which are clearly very similar to Shashi's. And I'll read one of them from Swimmer Among the Stars. It says, and this is right at the beginning of your story, ethnographers show up at the door with digital recorders ready to archive every declension, every instance of the genitive, the idiosyncratic function of the verbal suffices. And I thought, not many people in the US would understand this sentence.
There are many polysyllabic words in that sentence because this is a story about anthropologists who are recording, a linguist basically, recording the language of a woman who is the last speaker of this language. And so those are grammatical, technical terms. But I hope that kind of polysyllabic cacophony there isn't what defines the story.
They don't teach grammar anymore these days like they taught in St. Xavier's in your time, do they?
And they don't need to. I think the main thing is to be able to express yourself clearly.
I'm going to ask a personal question to you now. One of the criticisms of twins is, and I hate to confess I'm one as well, is that they spend far too much time with each other and spend very little time in constructive reading and writing. You've obviously proved that wrong. I mean, I'm an illustration of that fact, I think, but you've obviously proved it wrong. Did you ever think that having a twin brother all the time was an impediment to your progressing in creative writing, reading, and thinking, or was it was he a very helpful companion to have at your elbow?
I fully endorse being a twin. For me, it's one of the most probably positive shaping forces in my life, being a twin. And, yes, we actually did read together. We actually wrote together when we were small. So I don't think I think a lot of siblings, no matter how close they are, can have an undermining effect on each other. My brother and I think, reinforced each other's interests, reinforced each other's passions, and never allowed each other to be lonely. I think all these things, really helped make me who I am and give me the confidence as well to have interests. I think being a twin, when you share a lot in the world, it seems like the natural thing to do. You don't doubt yourself. So if you have some kind of geeky obsession at the age of 13 that you both share, you don't feel embarrassed about it, you don't shirk from it, you allow yourself to explore these things because you have the confidence, I suppose, or not even confidence, because it's not even a conscious thing, but you have the presence of another person who's there with you as you go embark on this process. We have two of our best friends are also twins, and they were raised in a very different way than we were, in which their parents consciously tried to instill in them a separate sense of identity from each other. My parents were very laissez-faire. They let us, I think, take care of each other sometimes. And so we really enjoyed each other's company all the time. And I think for both of us as writers, knowing that I think both of us, the other person's voice and responses are always there in the back of each other's minds.
Do you get each other to vet your writings?
Yeah, I mean, Ishan is prolific, so he's writing every day. So he doesn't really, his metabolism is such that he doesn't really have the time to wait for my edits or something. But, when I write a long piece of fiction, he is one of my first readers along with my parents and my wife. So, yes, I mean, I think it's a more of a one-way street in this regard because my brother, as a journalist, has to write much more quickly and is so fluent and so competent that I don't think he really needs my advice here.
When they were small, it was interesting that I did sometimes wonder. I remember one particular episode, one of them was trying to read, and the other one came on and said, "No, let's play." And the reader put down his book and went off and played. I thought, "Oh my God, it's just going to be something that's going to destroy whatever intellectual prospects they had." But of course, they turned out to be very intellectually developed and to strengthen each other.
I always had a trouble remembering who was vegetarian and who was not.
This is the vegetarian, right there. But the other thing is that they were also incredibly close, and the woman that I always cherish, and it's almost a metaphor for that closeness, was when they were about 1 year old, maybe a little more than that, not much more, vocabulary was not extensive. And one of them smashed a crystal goblet or something in the living room. And I, in mock anger, said, "Who did that?" And this fellow, I think it was Ishan actually, ran from year to year, pointed at Kanishk and said, "Me!"
Well, I'm not going to let Shashi speak anymore because I'm going to tell you a small little secret. Minu, before she left for the US, made 2 requests to me for this show. One was I should actually buy Kanishk's book, not borrow the book from his grandmother, as I've done. And second, that I should make sure that Kanishk speaks more than his father in this session of ours. So I hope I've done that, Kanishk. And I'm now going to just allow you to take some very quick questions from the audience. Yeah, we have Siddharth Ghosh right in front. Do you want to take?
This is addressed to Kanishk. Kanishk, we know that your father has been a star from a very young age. We know that from school. But tell me, as you were very fortunate to have 2 parents who've instilled the love of the spoken word, and when you first wielded your pen, what was the first driving force? Was it aspiration, inspiration, and I hope never intimidation?
Well, when I first began writing, it was purely for fun. I mean, this was something, I think these were the fairly early days of computers my father had, who was always an early adopter of technology. He had this clunky desktop computer with a sort of blue screen word processor. And I think in part because my brother and I found it quite fun to tap on this machine, we would write little stories on it. I mean, we'd also scribble in our terrible handwriting as well. But we wrote for fun. And it was something that we weren't, our parents never said to us, "Oh, you should sit down now and write." I don't think you did, at least. But we did it for fun, and we wrote really silly little things. I remember one of the earliest things I wrote for fun was a story, and Sanjeev Sanyal was just here, so he might find this interesting and improbable, but a story about a Mauryan Empire-era naval commander. Now, obviously, there was, I suppose, some kind of historical inspiration there. I certainly wasn't intimidated by the impossibility of it, and, I think there was a lot of pleasure and fun in the writing.
Any other questions?
Sir, in the context of your recent speech in the Oxford Union, sir, the railways developed under the British. Is it just a myth or is it a fact?
Sorry, yeah, the railways were developed by the British, but to serve British interests. They were developed so that they could exploit the Indian hinterland, because they'd largely been confined to the coastal provinces, And with the railways, they could go deep into the countryside, extract more resources, and through the railway lines, those resources could reach the ports and be sent off to England. So it was very much an instrument of colonial domination. It was also built for the profit of the British. That is, that building the Indian railways was the single most profitable investment you could make in the London Stock Exchange between about 1850 and 1875, because a guaranteed rate of return was given to investors, paid for by the Indian taxpayer. So the railways were built so lavishly that each mile of Indian railway cost 9 times the price of the same mile in Australia, Canada, or the US at the same time. Similarly, they ran it as a completely racist enterprise, so that right up to the First World War, every single official bar the most menial jobs, including ticket collectors and station masters, had to be European. So they only hired white Europeans in the Indian Railway. The question of passenger demand, where Indians wanted to travel, was completely irrelevant to the construction of railway lines. It was only what served British purposes. And when they did tack these third-class wagons on at the end for Indian labourers and so on to travel with these appalling wooden slats that pass for benches, they charged Indian passengers the highest passenger rates in the world, while charging British companies the lowest freight rates for the use of the railways. So it's only after 1947, when India came to independence, that this logic was turned around, that we actually had the passenger rates being subsidized, new lines being constructed from populated areas to other populated areas, and so on. And of course, freight rates have gone up perhaps now to an uneconomic degree. But the fact is that this change only came after independence. Till then, the railways were there to serve the British colonial interests, and that's all.
Last question. Shashi, before you take the question, I can't help telling you a story about railways and Britain and their condescending attitude towards Indians and railways. When I was going to give my FRCS exam in London, traveling in the Central Line, there was a British registrar from St. Thomas's, who was standing next to me, and he turned around and said to me, "You must have difficulty traveling in a train under the ground and coming from Calcutta as you do." And I said, "No, actually, we have a metro in Calcutta." There was silence for about 3 tube stations after that, after which he said, "Oh, when did you get your underground railway in Calcutta?" And I said, 1984. And there was a sort of a sigh of relief almost from him, palpable as the way he looked up towards the heavens and then turned down at me and said, "You know, in London, we had ours from 1884. I guess you couldn't have had one then." And I just couldn't help but tell him, then we couldn't afford to pay for 2, you see. So I thought you'd like that story.
Very, very good.
Last question.
This question is for Shashi sir. Sir, as you had started your career with the United Nations, I am also working with the United Nations. And I want to ask you that this book, Era of Darkness, is based on your speech at the Oxford. You had also given a very fantastic speech in TEDx speaking about education system and the future of India, the way to the future. Can we see a book in the future about India's future or something like that?
Done. Both my TED speeches have gone into books, in the sense that my original TED speech on soft power is a chapter in Pax Indica, obviously expanded and substantiated. And similarly, my speech on education is reflected in 3 chapters of India Shastra, which was published in 2015, India Shastra, Reflections on the Nation in Our Time. I didn't think they justified the entire book, but there's a good chunk there.
We'll
Thank
take
you,
a
sir.
last question for Kanishk, because we want him to have the last word.
Totally.
I read one of the most stories which struck me was The Weight of an Eyelash, remarkably sensible. And I wanted to ask you that, were you always like this, your eyes scurrying for the finer details and the heartfelt, subtle imagery, or is it only when you are in the imaginative sphere that you look for it and pen them down?
Well, thank you so much for reading the book and for responding to that story. I do have a very visual imagination, as has been discussed. And I am always looking, I think, one of the ways as a writer of prose, that I move through the world is in a very, I'm always absorbing images. And, and I find pleasure in writing probably most when I'm describing those. And those, I think in that story that you mentioned, that is the sort of recurring sensory, visual motif, I suppose. And yeah, no, I mean, so as when I'm sort of venturing about, going through the world, going through my days, I'm always sort of absorbing the visual world around me, and that does come out in my fiction.
Thank you very much, Kanishk. Thank you, Shashi. Ladies and gentlemen, a great father and son combination to have. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us this wonderful conversation together.